I'm going to introduce now our speaker. We're very honored to have Andrew with us. He's a constitutional attorney, the director of strategic response at FFRF, and an author. He graduated cum laude from Tulane University in 2004 with a bachelor's degree in neuroscience and environmental science, and magna cum laude from Tulane University Law School, where he was awarded J. McCarthy Award for Excellence in Environmental Law. He studied human rights and international law at the University of Amsterdam and traveled the world through the semester at sea. He completed his Master of Laws at Denver University's Stern College of Law with a perfect GPA and was awarded the Outstanding LLM Award. When not fighting for the First Amendment, Andrew writes for Think Progress, Religion News Services, Rewire News, and other places. And he joined FFRF as a constitutional consultant on Halloween, we're not suspicious, in 2011. So please welcome and turn your attention to Andrew.
Thank you. Yes, Dan Barker likes to say that I've been scaring the hell out of Christian nationalists ever since I joined FFRF on that Halloween day. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate that warm introduction. So for those of you that have been following my work at FFRF, you know that I also published a book not too long ago called The Founding Myth: Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. And it's not often, I can't think of another example, it's not often that you choose a subtitle for a book and then the subject runs out to prove you right. But exactly 5 months ago, on this day, right? Yeah, exactly 5 months ago, Christian nationalists attacked American democracy. And they attempted to overturn the results of a free and fair election. And they proved beyond all doubt that Christian nationalism is un-American. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, Christian nationalism is the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation, that we're based on Judeo-Christian principles, and that we've strayed from that foundation. And so they use the idea that we have to return to it, that we have to get back to our godly roots to justify their modern crusade, to take over the government, to pass the laws, to take over the courts, all these different things. And on January 6th, Christian nationalism ripped off its mask. And it showed that it's not a scholarly debate about how America was founded. Were we based on Judeo-Christian principles? Were we founded as a Christian nation? It's not about that. Instead, Christian nationalism is a violent exclusionary movement that is bent on seizing power in the here and now. And since January 6th, I have been just scouring the photos and the videos, and I've been watching the court cases and in some cases the proceedings. It's one of the few ways the pandemic has helped, putting everything online. And if you just dip your toe into this world, it is alarming. But I have immersed myself into it, and I am more convinced than ever about the role that Christian nationalism played in attacking our democracy on January 6th. I mean, I'm sure that many of you, like me, watched in horror as the assault itself unfolded. But I want to set the stage a little bit to remind you all of just a bit of the Christian nationalism from that day. So Paula White, you know, the mega preacher, the prosperity gospel preacher speaking in tongues, Paula White, began the day with a prayer at that rally right in front of the White House, the rally that Trump would later speak at on that same stage. And in true Christian nationalist fashion, she added the United States of America to the Lord's Prayer that was written in Matthew 6, chapter 6 of the Bible. So she added America to a prayer that, according to the Bible, Jesus himself prescribed and crafted. In that same chapter, Jesus also tells people to pray in private and not pray in public like the hypocrites that want to be seen praying by others. But for some reason, Christian nationalists always tend to ignore that biblical command. So the rally that began with that prayer ended with Trump calling on his mob to march to the Capitol. And his last words were the same words that Nixon used to distract the country from Watergate. God bless you and God bless America. I tell in one of the final chapters of The Founding Myth, I tell the story of that tradition of presidents ending their speeches and addresses with God Bless the United States of America, or some, minor variation of that, you can trace back to Nixon's first address from the Oval Office on Watergate. And he was using religion to distract the country and to cloak himself in the mantle of morality by substituting religion for morality. And as Trump's mob walked from the rally over to the Capitol, impromptu worship concerts broke out on the wall. On their march to the Capitol, the Proud Boys, the white nationalist group, the Proud Boys, were hailed as God's warriors, and they knelt in prayer that was full of just this typical Christian nationalist rhetoric about restoring the nation. So they marched and then they attacked. One attacker carried a Christian flag onto the floor of the Senate. The absurdly self-proclaimed QAnon shaman led a prayer in the Senate about patriotism, Jesus, and restoring the nation, ending that prayer in Jesus' name. One of the praying insurrectionists gave an interview later, and he talked about that same prayer at the Senate, and he said, we, quote, consecrated it to Jesus. That, to me, was the ultimate statement of where we are in this movement. And indeed, he's right. A third praying insurrectionist posted a video saying, I just wanted to get inside the building so I could plead the blood of Jesus over it. That was my goal. In that same video, he spends 40 minutes recounting every act, most of it pleading the blood of Jesus. But he attributes every action to a dialogue that he had with Jesus. And he recounts this dialogue in the video. God told him to do it. That's what he's saying. He also said he would start a prison ministry when he was sent away for his crimes. Another insurrectionist, this video went viral, you may have seen it, was sipping a post-assault beer, and she told her social media followers exactly why she attacked the beating heart of American democracy. She said, to me, God and country are tied. To me, they're one and the same. We are founded as a Christian country, and we see how far we've come from that. We are a godly country, and we were founded on godly principles. Right? So the idea that we are a Christian country and that we have slipped away from those founding principles is the central tenet of Christian nationalism. And it's their primary justification for harmful and retrogressive public policy. And that idea provided the permission structure for the attack on January 6th. And the imagery of that day, it really is now infamous. And I think that's rightfully so. The huge wooden cross juxtaposed with the gallows from which they wanted to hang elected officials. They actually signed the gallows as if it were a yearbook, writing, hang them high, in God we trust, God bless the USA, hang for treason and amen on the gallows. The flags and the signs they held were absolutely clear. Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president. One nation under God, in God we trust, Jesus saves, Jesus 2020. They had Bible verses, they had crosses. One sign simply said, I am on your side, God, as if God signed that. There were images of, the Catholic versions of Jesus and Mary on banners, paintings, framed paintings being carried, and statues even, some borne atop poles over the attackers' heads. And I saw in one of the videos, a couple of videos actually, a Bible. You can see a Bible raised above the crowd, like a Napoleonic eagle as the mob surges through one of the entrances. One of the people who entered the Capitol was a Catholic priest. He admitted on camera to exorcising the demon Baphomet. Another was a youth pastor from Florida. Others were missionaries. They sang the battle hymn of the Republic. Glory, glory, hallelujah, his truth is marching on, and prayed in the rotunda. One group, called the Jericho March, was founded by two federal workers who were sent visions from God to, quote, let the church roar. And for those of you who haven't read your Bible lately, the Battle of Jericho was a genocide. In the story, the biblical God orders his followers to march around the city while blowing their shofars or ram's horns and carrying the ark holding God's commandments. And then they are ordered to violently sack the city, steal the valuables, and murder every living thing, including the animals. So you have this organization, the Jericho March, that baptized itself after a biblical genocide and then reenacted that slaughter by blowing shofars and marching around government buildings in DC and in state capitals, declaring that this is one nation under God and organizing rallies alongside the Stop the Steal charlatans. And all that was in the lead up to January 6th, basically from December 12th all the way through. And it wasn't just the imagery and the rhetoric, because all of that is just an expression of a devout belief that this is a Christian nation and that God chose Donald Trump. And remember, Trump himself looked up and said, I am the chosen one, and that God was on their side. The attacker who kicked in Speaker Pelosi's door, hoping to tear her into, quote, little pieces, his rantings were recounted at one of his court hearings. And he said, quote, God is on Trump's side. God is not on the Democrats' side. And if patriots have to kill 60 million of these communists, it is God's will. Now, there were, of course, other motivations and drivers of this attack. But the Christian nationalist permission structure, doing God's will, fighting for God's law, returning the country to its Christian roots, that pervaded the other drivers of the attack. For instance, the insurrection had this distinct QAnon flavor. But now we know, we've seen study after study linking and exposing the link between QAnon and Christian nationalism, and between QAnon and white evangelicalism. And this was also a largely white crowd, right? The Black Lives Matter protesters in DC neither received nor expected such leniency that summer of 2020. Trump said, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. He said that in May 2020, but that phrase has a very long racist history. And Trump had, everybody remember, I mean, we just had this anniversary. I couldn't believe it when it popped up. Trump had peaceful protesters gassed, beaten, and brutalized with rubber bullets so that he could walk to a church and pose with a Bible for a photo op. And the point of that malignant stroll was to show that we are a Bible-believing, Bible-beating nation, and anyone who disagrees with that should be beaten and gassed. And those scenes harken back to some of America's most shameful history. So when we're speaking of Christian nationalism, we're speaking of white Christian nationalism. And this was a privileged mob that roamed the halls without fear. They were brazenly entitled. Perhaps they mistakenly believed that Trump would pardon them. But they certainly believed that this is their country given to them by their God, and that they were acting on his orders and defending his chosen one. And when reality collides with a belief system like that, violence is almost inevitable. Entitlement and violence. Those are the watchwords from that day. And all of it is based on disinformation, right? Christian nationalism is an entire identity based on disinformation. It's not a scholarly debate about our history. It's this sinister exclusionary movement. It is an attempt to redefine America according to Christian nationalist disinformation, and then to reshape our law accordingly. And you have heard this disinformation before. You've heard it many times, that we're one nation under God. In God we trust. That the Declaration of Independence references the Christian God 4 different times. That they prayed at the Constitutional Convention when they were writing our Constitution. That George Washington knelt in the snow at Valley Forge and prayed. That our laws are based on the Golden Rule, or more importantly, that our laws are based on the 10 Commandments. Right? None of that is true. None of it. And without their origin myths, their identity withers. So their entire political and ideological reality is vulnerable because it's based on disinformation. And this becomes clear when you explore the myth and the lies that really underlie this truly un-American political ideology. Because it's not just that this identity is based on disinformation, it's bigger. It's that Judeo-Christian principles, and especially those that are central to the Christian nationalist identity, are thoroughly opposed to the principles on which the United States was built. The two systems differ and conflict in fundamental and irreconcilable ways. Now, before I open this up to questions, which I hope we have plenty of time for, I want to take on one of the more common myths that I always see a little bit in the springtime. And it was in the news a little bit lately because North Dakota passed a law trying to get 10 Commandments displayed in their public schools. So let's just talk just briefly about how the 10 Commandments fundamentally conflict with our nation's core principles. And I cover this in the founding myth in part 3 in depth. I actually walk you through each of the 10 Commandments and explain this. And it's true that some of the 10 Commandments overlap with criminal laws that, for instance, prohibit murder and theft and perjury, including laws in the great state of Minnesota. But those rules are not exclusive or original to Judeo-Christianity. Those are universal human principles that every successful society we are aware of has adopted on their own. And there's actually really compelling evidence to suggest that the biblical version of these prohibitions, the ones that appear in the 10 Commandments, didn't apply to anyone but the fellow believers. In other words, the biblical version of the universal principles was not universal. Either way, it is very hard to credibly claim that the biblical iteration of those universal rules influenced the founding of the United States of America. And the rest of the 10 Commandments are downright un-American. They begin, "I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me." I mean, that is a divine command that embodies principles that directly conflict with the principles on which the United States was founded. No law can tell an American to worship a God, let alone which God. Americans are free to be godless, and a growing number of us are, or they can worship every God from every holy book if they want. And the commandments continue in this un-American vein. They prohibit free expression and art in the graven images and idols commandment. They prohibit free speech, taking the Lord's name in vain. They sanction slavery twice, Exodus 20 and Exodus 20:17, Exodus 20:10 and Exodus 20:17. The 10 Commandments even promise to punish innocent children to the 3rd and 4th generation if parents are brazen enough to exercise the religious freedom guaranteed in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. I mean, pause to really appreciate that. The 10 Commandments, supposedly God's most moral law, promise to punish innocent children for 4 generations for the crimes their parents commit. That crime being a right protected under our First Amendment. And the 10th Commandment is probably the worst. I mean, it condones slavery, it treats women as chattel, and it criminalizes thought. And most of the 10 Commandments monuments that you'll see on public property or in public spaces, they edit out those more horrific parts. They edit out punishing children. They edit out the mentions of slavery. And think about what a damning statement that really is. We use our morality to cut out the immoral parts of the 10 Commandments, including the mentions of slavery and the punishing of innocent children. So the monuments are an admission that we are more moral as human beings than God's most moral laws. And they don't even realize this when they put these monuments up. Anyway, the comparison between Christianity and Judeo-Christianity and the American constitutional system continues like this. And this is, I could list plenty more, but I do want to get to questions, so I'm going to start wrapping it up. And if you want plenty more, pick up a copy of The Founding Myth. So hopefully everybody's a little concerned about Christian nationalism now. The good news is that we can beat Christian nationalism. We can relegate it back to the fringe whence it came by exposing the disinformation that feeds the identity. We are not going to convince all the Christian nationalists to change or that they're wrong, but we can alert most of the country to the danger and prevent our government from giving aid and succor to this un-American identity, the same un-American identity that assaulted our democracy. The entire identity is based on lies and myths, but it is validated by modern representations of the myths that previous Christian nationalists have imposed on the country during crises. So their erroneous beliefs are validated when they see "In God We Trust" on money or on government building, or when school children are told that this is one nation under God. When Congress opens with prayers that assures every Christian nationalist every Christian nationalist, excuse me, that this is indeed his America. Those 10 Commandments monuments that sit on government property proclaim, I am the Lord thy God. So the Christian nationalist identity draws its legitimacy from these artifacts that have been left by previous waves of Christian nationalism that the country has endured. So these relics are really disfiguring scars. And that ought to remind us that Christian nationalists have justified slavery, that they've sanctified segregation, and now inspired an insurrection. Instead, the scars reinforce an un-American identity. And until we erase those scars, we are giving aid and comfort to a traitor to the American philosophy. So America is, at its most basic level, a shared idea. And Christian nationalism refuses to share. It excludes non-Christians and the worst kind of Christians. America, I think I just said worst kind of. It excludes non-Christians and the wrong kind of Christians. My brain's doing funny things, guys. I haven't had enough coffee. Sorry. America will never be a Christian nation because the moment it becomes a Christian nation, it will cease to be America. The two things cannot peacefully coexist. One will triumph. And that is the choice that we face as a nation right now. Christian nationalism or America. Because we can't have both. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, let's express our appreciation for that talk. That was lovely, organized, clear. And now we hope to hear from various and sundry people talking about perhaps our removal of the 10 Commandments here, done by Dr. Bill and Dale Hagen years ago, and other things about which you may want to debate if you want to speak.
And Jim, can I just mention two quick housekeeping things for myself first? I should have done this earlier, sorry.
Sure.
Again, there's a lot more information in my book, The Founding Myth. Some of you might remember that was burned by a Christian nationalist preacher, a guy named Greg Locke. So if you want a signed copy of the book that scared the man who stoked the fires of the insurrection, Greg Locke was actually in DC on January 5th. He spoke on stage at a rally for the Proud Boys and prayed for the Proud Boys and talked about spiritual warfare. I mean, it was really deeply alarming and very Christian nationalist speech. Anyway, if you want to get a signed copy of the book that scared the man who stoked the fires of insurrection to the point where he took a blowtorch to the book, you can do that through the FFRF website. I mentioned this earlier, but I know some people have signed on since then. So if you order a copy through FFRF, so go to ffrf.org, click on our store, you can get a copy of The Founding Myth. When you're checking out, you can leave a little note in a comment box during checkout and just ask for a signed copy. And I'm happy to personalize it as well. And those are going to be collector's editions pretty soon because The Founding Myth is coming out in paperback. And it's going to have a new epilogue that focuses specifically on the January 6th insurrection. And I'm not going to be signing copies of that through the FFRF store. So if you order a signed copy of the hardback, you're not going to be missing anything. And if you only want the paperback, you can pre-order copies of that right now. Okay, thank you, Jim.
Terrific. Good. So let's see if we can have questions by just unmute yourself, ask the question. We'll need to be courteous to one another and try to be brief. And here we go.
Yeah, if I could jump in here at the moment. I just want to make a nice talk, by the way. I really enjoyed it. But I just want to share, some of these books are a little outdated, but one of them is American Fascists, The Christian Right and the War on America by Chris Hedges. It's, I think it was done in 2006, so you'll have to find it somewhere. A more recent one is The Immoral Majority, Why Evangelicals Chose Political Power Over Christian Values by Ben Howe. Both of these guys, by the way, I think are Christians. And a much older one is called The American Theocracy by a conservative by the name of Kevin Phillips. I think they're interesting because these guys aren't exactly lefties. So these are people who are within the realm of the Christian world or conservative world who are already raising the alarm about Christian nationalism.
Yeah, those are all excellent books. Another one that was published around the same time that I would recommend is Michelle Goldberg's Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism, which sort of predicted a lot of what happened. If you want more Modern books, and here's another two recommendations. So this is Taking America Back for God, Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry. Those two are the leading sociologists when it comes to studying Christian nationalism. They have a lot of great demographic information in their book and really work to try to define the identity. And they're also both members of a group called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Another one is White Too Long by Robert P. Jones, who is the executive director of PRRI, which is the Public Religion Research Institute, I think. And then another one that I'm reading right now that I'm about halfway through that I really would recommend is called White Evangelical Racism by Dr. Anthea Butler, who is a professor at University of Pennsylvania. She's a professor of history, and it's a beautifully written survey of how racism and evangelical Christianity are really intimately tied together, going back to kind of the rise of that in the United States. It's one of those books that's very easy to read, so highly recommend that too.
Could you get Don, our secretary, a copy of that list so we can put it in our newsletter?
I can try to do that.
No, good, thanks.
I'd like to add to the list, Andrew, first of all, thank you for an excellent talk and really inspiring. I'd like to add one more to the list of books that people might consider. This is One Nation Under God, and it focuses on the emergence of In God We Trust and adding God to the Pledge of Allegiance, and all these steps that occurred during the Eisenhower administration.
Yeah, so that's Kevin Kruse's book, and Kevin Kruse, K-R-U-S-E, is a professor at Princeton, and that book came out when I was writing The Founding Myth, and I had to rewrite. I have a chapter that covers that time frame, and I had to rewrite the entire chapter based on Kevin's work. And I actually said I knew him previously and sent him a copy of, or a draft of that chapter of my book, and said, "Hey, you ruined what I had written, and I had to rewrite everything, and now you have to look at this and edit it for me." And he was kind enough to do that. Kevin's a good friend. That book is fantastic, and the reason I love that book too is because it really is. There's so much good new research done in that book. I mean, you can tell this is a historian that likes to be in the archives digging up new history, and did just a beautiful job of really telling that story. So I highly recommend that book as well. Thank you, Charles.
A quick comment for people here in Duluth. I have this as an audio book on DVDs, and if anybody wants to borrow it, just let me know.
Andrew, I had a question about two questions. One was that I have a vague impression that the United States was founded as a Christian nation because not the founding fathers, the ones in the late 18th century, but earlier, a lot of the colonists at the very beginning seem to have been religious fanatics of one sort or another, including the Puritans at Plymouth.
Yeah.
And Maryland, I think, was founded as a Catholic colony, and there's a Quaker colony and so forth. So it's got this religious imprint all over the early colonies. And the second unrelated question is, to what extent do you think the rapid public morality changes over the last 20 years or more have fueled this movement? And in particular, I'm thinking of the enormous change in gay rights, the abortion. I've read that a lot of this started, you had a realignment of parties that began with Roe v. Wade, and over less than 15 years or so, it moved people from, in the South in particular, from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, because these were such hot button emotional moral issues. So relatively, if you look at the overall history of the United States, this is a pretty short period to be making huge changes, and that's bound to have some consequences.
Yeah, I mean, both good questions, and both I do get into in the founding myth. I was just trying to remember. I didn't want to misstate which chapter, but chapter 5 is all about the colonies and the myth that you're talking about, and that settlers came here looking for religious freedom and to establish colonies that were based on religious freedom, which you seem to not buy into as much, which is correct. You shouldn't buy into it. They were fanatics looking to establish their own little theocracies, but not everywhere. And they're like for instance, the colony in New Amsterdam, and I try to do this in the book, is a much better comparator for what the United States looks like now and what it was meant to look like. And when the founding fathers, as we think of them, got together and started actively building a nation and crafting a constitution, they looked back and surveyed the history of both North America and more Europe and Greece. They looked at, they found examples of things not to do as well. And the little, monochromatic theocracies up in New England were examples of how not to craft a nation or a state. And I have a lot of that information in here. Well, I could talk about that one for a very long time. If people want to ask follow-ups, I'm happy to talk more about it. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of a common misconception. Okay, fine. I'll say 2 other things about it. One is that we tend to have in the American psyche, the Pilgrims and the Puritans of Massachusetts are overrepresented in terms of their impact, because by and large, most of the historians that are writing American history have come from that same area, which is not something you think about. There's a bias in the American Historical Academy, and has been for centuries, for those particular settlements, and not focusing on Maryland or South Carolina or Georgia or St. Augustine in Florida even. So anyway, I'll leave that there. As to your second point, I mean, there's a lot of good information about that. Again, Anthea Butler is just talking about the realignment and how really it's more tied to racism than it is to Roe, and that Roe was more of an excuse and a galvanizing factor. When Roe actually was decided, it was a big deal for women's rights, but it didn't generate a whole lot of immediate religious backlash. It does seem to have been more deliberately chosen by Paul, by Wayrick and Jerry Falwell and Dobson, and all these old white men got together and decided that they were going to make that an issue and form the moral majority, etc. But Dr. Anthea Butler in White Evangelical Racism, which I'm reading right now, is talking about how actually this is really more tied to racism, and they were just using this as a way to get people excited and put a palatable public face on their racism. And there are plenty of awful quotes to go along with that. I think the larger point, though, is that historically speaking, it is secularism and secular values that bring social change and progress. Religion is almost by nature, almost by definition, certainly by nature, invested in the status quo, because that's where it has power. And I do get into this in the founding as well. Social change tends to come from secular quarters and secular values, and then that drags religion along with it. And that's counterintuitive. For a lot of people, that seems like the tail wagging the dog. But that it's only counterintuitive because religion later comes along and claims credit for secular values forcing that change. And you can actually see this happening right now, David, with what you were talking about with LGBTQ rights. I mean, if think back to 10 years ago, every argument and everyone on the side of gay people should not be able to marry were using religious arguments at their most basic level, were religious. And now you're starting to see that narrative shifting, where I've even seen some claiming that Christianity is responsible for marriage equality. And you're more and more, I think you're going to see that changing, especially as more and more young people leave the church, being sickened by their stance on LGBTQ rights. So I do get into that in the founding myth. Actually, there's I don't want to get his name wrong. I might have to look it up. There's a researcher, I believe he's at the University of Minnesota, who's done some great work on this too.
You know, Andrew, just a quick comment. It is not surprising to me that progress
Let me see if I can look that up quick. Well,
secular quarters, because of the nature
sure.
of how people regard truth. If you regard truth as immutable, you're not going to be looking for progress and change. And if you believe truth as being subject to further scrutiny, further logic, further experimentation, then you're going to be looking for opportunities to improve.
I'd like to add something if I could. There's something I've noticed.
I think the more that you think about it, the more it makes sense. I think the more that you think about it, the more it makes sense. It's just that it's counterintuitive for a lot of people. But the professor is Mark Smith, who I'm pretty sure is at Minnesota, by the way. So, and somebody wanted to add something.
Hi, one of the things that's standing right in front of us all the time, and I think is the basis of every Christian nationalist or most people with religions, is that they tend to live in a world that is part of their God's plan. That's always part of the way they're thinking. If they oppose something, it's because it's not part of God's plan. If they want something to happen, it's because it's part of God's plan. This is so obvious that we don't even notice it, but it's part of every argument. And I think it's so obvious that the rest of us don't use it, because really all we'd have to say is, well, I have a particular God that this is part of the plan. And I don't know how they can retort to that, except to tell me I have the wrong God. But I could play the role of having a God and that's what's going on anyway, right? So it's just an easy way to argue with people, not to argue, but to point out that God's plans are pretty optional. They're pretty optional. They're based on people's income. They're based on their background. They're based on the particular God they were brought up with. There's all kinds of God's plans out there, and none of them have any more claim on a democracy than any other claim. And that's how I would approach talking about it. It's just inherent in every conversation with a religionist person that they are in favor of something because they interpret it as part of God's plan, their God's plan.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Susan B. Anthony had a quote on that I'm going to get not quite right. She said something like how she distrusts people who know what God wants them to do because it always coincides with their own desires.
The other thing I would do is, as an attorney in a court case, when someone claims they make claims because of their beliefs, but their beliefs are based on being told about their claim by their God. In any other court case, the opposing attorney would be able to ask to call the witness to the stand, which means you should be able to call their God for an interrogation on cross-examination. And I don't know why we don't think of that, because it would throw the claim out. Any other claim in a case that you can't prove and you can't find a witness for or a collaborating witness for.
Well, I mean, partly because that's not typically the way it would work,
Okay.
but more because courts are very reluctant to examine the sincerity of a religious belief, with the big exception being prisoners in jail who are claiming they have a religious belief. That courts are willing to. Most of the time, courts accept as true the stated religious beliefs in court and are unwilling to do more than that. And the Hobby Lobby case is actually a really great example of this, right? Like the Hobby Lobby said they believed, they being a corporation organized under state law, but actually the owners believed that these several drugs were abortifacients, that is, they caused abortions. And that's not even a religious belief. That's a scientific belief that is either true or false. And it's false. They were not abortifacients. But they were pushing it as, well, we get to decide the question of abortion is a religious issue to us, and we're saying it is. So it is. And the court didn't bother to look at the truth or the sincerity of that, even though the company had invested, Hobby Lobby, its owners and its retirement fund had been invested in the companies that made those abortifacients in the run-up to the litigation, meaning they obviously didn't care about it enough to not help fund that work. But yeah, it's a problem, and I am talking about that a good bit in the new book that I'm working on, Weaponizing Religious Freedom. But it's a problem.
Andrew, this is a sort of a follow-up, but more general. It seems to me that there was a parallel between religious, personal morality, and family moral law. A parallel between the religions and the state, the government. So the government enforced morality.
Mm-hmm.
The government made it hard to get divorced. The government enforced all these rules, and then at some point in the 20th century, they started to come apart. And as you say, that from the secular side, there was increasing divergence between traditional religious codes and what the state was willing to enforce. And this is bound to have some kind of an effect. In particular, it seems to me, it's because most people believe there is no secular alternative for basing morality. That is, say, God gives us, if God doesn't give you a moral code, you have none, right? There is no foundation. Even John Locke, who's in this Letters on Tolerance, is defending all sorts of tolerance of different religious views, has an explicit exclusion for atheists because they're willing to do anything. They don't believe there are any consequences for however you behave. And I believe that view. So Locke's very smart, but there are lots of people who aren't so smart who believe that now, and I'm not sure that they're crazy either, because there is no obvious alternative, no consensus alternative to religiously based moral codes.
Yeah, I mean, I do get into this quite a bit in the founding myth too. Well, specifically the family values stuff, but also the idea of religiously based morality. I mean, I think you can, it does take a lot of work to debunk that myth. But, I mean, again, let's go back to the 10 Commandments monuments. They are changing God's most moral law, excuse me, to edit out the immoral parts. And that's because they're using their own morality to judge God's morality, and they found it wanting. And I have found, at least talking person to person, it to be effective to get people to use their own morality to condemn the morality of their religion, whether it be the 10 Commandments and punishing innocent children, or something else that you can pull from say the New Testament. But another area where you see this pop up that I also get into in the founding myth is the idea of God-given rights. And so, but the problem with all of this is that history has shown us that what can be given by God-given rights, can be taken away by those claiming to speak for that God. So slavery was God's will until it wasn't. Segregation and anti-miscegenation laws were meant to keep the races separate as God intended. The opposition to same-sex marriage was largely based on religion. And progress in many of these important areas of human rights has been opposed by those claiming to know God's mind and executing God's will. I mean, yeah, religion helps in some cases, but the opposing justifications are nearly always situated in that divine law. Whereas human rights are absolute and universal. They're not susceptible to religious whim and fancy. Simply by virtue of being human, just because you were born, you have certain inherent inalienable rights. I mean, and this is something I really talk about in the founding myth. Like, God-given rights depend on geography. Do you live in Indiana, India, or Iran? They depend on those who claim to know God's will. Do your leaders think that Muhammad or Martin Luther or Martin Luther King Jr.'s interpretation of God's will is correct? I mean, so God-given rights are problematic, and this goes to what you're talking about too, because at their most basic level, they depend solely on one individual's interpretation of his God's will. So one person's belief is suddenly given the weight of divine law. A fallible human being is claiming a divine sanction. So that is the same moral relativism which is so often maligned by religious leaders, masquerading as moral absolutism. And masquerading as moral absolutism with a divine sanction as the will of God. So it's far better to premise morality and human rights on the simple fact of being human than to put them in the hands of a person claiming to speak for a supernatural being that may or doesn't exist.
Well, what are the actual human rights, the non-God-given rights? There aren't any. You have no right to anything except you can get it.
Well, I'll strongly disagree with that. I don't know that I want to fully debate how you get into the human rights themselves right now. But I mean, one great place to start would be the international covenants on human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on Economic Rights. Those kinds of things would be a great place to start. But yeah, I mean, it does take a certain amount of agreement to enforce those, for sure. But enforcement and possession, I think we could agree, are probably not the same thing.
Well, a right actually can be described as something that you can appeal to and achieve. And somebody will back it up. But across the world, that isn't the case. There are lots of people.
Yeah,
it's miserable. Anyway, basically, you don't have any human rights except what you want to claim.
Yeah, again, I'll disagree with that. I disagree with that.
Where do you get those rights?
I'll disagree with that. And again, I'm not going to set up and have the whole debate about that right now. I mean, I think that's a little outside the scope of the discussion, and we're already on an hour, and I have a hard stop in about 15 minutes. So I want to try to keep it. If you want to set up a debate about the origin of rights and the possession of human rights, I'd be happy to do that later on. But I want to try to keep a little bit focused.
If I can jump in here for a moment, I just want to comment on, that we were talking about one man giving these old things. When I'm in a conversation, I often say, well, the only thing you can really say is that Moses said that God said. So the only thing you can do is believe in Moses. But I'm going to ask you a question. In your research and reading, I mean, have you come across the Dominionists, and are you aware of them?
Oh, I mean, the Dominionists are Christian nationalists. I mean, Seven Mountain Dominionism is Christian nationalist.
I mean, they're really extreme.
Yeah, I mean, they are. And one thing I encourage people to do, and I talk about this a lot after the book came out, is to not worry about, essentially ignore their theology, right? Like, you don't have to use the phrase dominionist. That's their term for what they want to do. Seven Mountain Dominionism is a flavor of their dominionism. Forget about that. Like, let's call a spade a spade. These are Christian nationalists trying to impose Christian nationalism on the country. And the virtue of that phrase, Christian nationalism or ist, is that people know pretty much right away what you're talking about. And even if they don't know, they actually have they can understand it from the phrase itself, at least to a certain extent. If you start talking about dominionism, and I can tell you this from experience, people's eyes glaze over. It shows that you're in the know, but you're not doing anything to help our side ring the alarm bells and raise awareness and point out that this is like a seriously problematic identity, that it is an existential threat to the republic. So I encourage everybody to stop talking about Christo-fascists and stop talking about the Talibangelicals. That's the one, and dominionists, and forget about all that. They are Christian nationalists. Call them that. People understand that phrase. Since January 6th, that phrase has come more into the mainstream, and it is viewed, I guess, ominously might be a good way to say that. So people seem to understand the threat inherently when you use that. So that's what I'll say there. Yeah, I mean, I've dug deep into Rushdoony and all that stuff, but again, my advice would be to not worry so much about their theology and worry about how to fight back. And one way to do that is to call them what they actually are, not what they want to be.
Is that the kind of way out of Catholicism? I don't know what dominionist is.
Dominionists are Christian nationalists that want to take over. They want to take over American government. The Seven Mountain Dominionism. They have 7 mountains of influence. Like arts and culture, that kind of stuff. And
Okay.
but also they want to stone homosexuals and adulterers, and I mean they're really going back to wanting to play out the entire biblical 10 commandments as part of their thinking, and they're basically sort of an outgrowth of the Baptists and evangelicals. They're not Catholic.
Andrew, I'd like to interject something here. When you were starting your presentation, I had a familiar feeling, and it probably went back about 35 or 40 years, because the tone of what's happening with Christian nationalism at that time for me was being kind of in the conversation of some of the first Christian nationalists, that this is what they're doing. Because I was an ordained minister then. And so I don't know if you're familiar with Francis Schaeffer, Christian philosopher. Mm-hmm. Way back then, there was this movement called the Restorationists, and they were wanting to bring the church and America back to the place that it was intended to be. And Francis Schaeffer, his son now, writes about it. Frankie Schaeffer, he was the producer of a film series called, let's see, How Then Shall We Live? And then it was also followed up later with a film series that went from church to church all over the country. And this went on for probably a couple of years or a few years. The follow-up one was Whatever Happened to the Human Race? And so what was going on then was we who were in the church were like infused or inoculated with threat. And what Frankie Schaeffer, Francis Schaeffer's son, is talking about now these days, and he has been for probably a decade, he's claiming responsibility for being one of the authors of the religious right, because he was the producer of this film series. And he says that he says, well, we just had to choose something. We had to choose a centerpiece threat, and that was abortion. It was the handiest thing that they could come up with at the time. See, Everett Koop was part of it. Possibly Billy Graham was part of it. And as you mentioned, Dobson was part of it.
Mhm.
But they had to put forth a threat, and they really didn't care that much about abortion. But they knew that if there was some fear in the church that, oh, they're going to change our way of life and they're going to change us being godly and right, then we've got something, and we can now move massive amounts of people, and we can move their thinking. And I see that as being kind of where people are now. They're not informed. They don't know the truth, but the reporting is actually quite accurate. I heard Mary Louise Kelly say this on NPR the other day. She says, oh, it's reporting is accurate. It's just not true. It's just not at all true. And so I think that's what's happening in the church is they're hearing a whole lot of facts, but they're not true.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong in what you're saying. First, since we've recommended a bunch of books too, let me recommend Sex and the Constitution by Professor Jeffrey Stone. He's a law professor, University of Chicago Law. So he worked with the Obamas. I think he was a law clerk on the court when Roe was decided, and kind of had I'm trying to remember back to it, but does a really good job of talking about Roe beforehand and whether it was really this big issue. And he doesn't get into the backroom stuff that we're talking about here, but more from the legal side of things. It was really fascinating in how/what it did. But yeah, I mean, this story about this backroom decision to make abortion the wedge issue moving forward is pretty well known by now. And I mean, we do know a lot of the facts, and they are damn close to realizing. I mean, they're about to catch this tiger by the tail. So for people who haven't been paying attention, the Supreme Court just accepted an abortion case out of Mississippi. And I think it's going to be the one. I mean, I wrote an article for Religion Dispatches talking about this case and how alarming it is that the Supreme Court accepted the case, and what's going to happen next. I mean, Amy Coney Barrett was put on the Supreme Court to write the opinion that undoes Roe. That is why they wanted her there. She is the culmination of everything that they were working for back in the 70s. I mean, how can it be an anti-woman opinion if it was written by a woman, right? And this is where we are heading. And I think the thing that I was trying to write about in the article that has me concerned is people are looking at Roe as the end point. Like, because we know what happened in these back rooms, because it has been the talking point and the wedge issue for so long, they're looking at Roe as nobody's looking past it. And that's really, with the way we are with the American court system right now, the federal courts, the Supreme Court in particular, it's been packed with Christian nationalists. Trump and McConnell did it. The overturning of Roe is just the beginning. I mean, I think it's pretty clear they're going to come for contraception next and immediately. I mean, it is just the beginning of what's going to be a very, very dark time. And it's one reason that I am fully committed to court reform and expansion. And I think every American ought to be supporting that full-throated support behind court expansion and reform as much as possible. We are in big trouble here.
So on that unhappy note, we have used up an awful lot of your time and patience, and we'll probably stick around and discuss amongst ourselves, but we need to let you go. And by the way, I looked up Mark, he's at Washington Political Science. That's right. Secular faith, right?
I think his book might have been published by Minnesota, now that you've mentioned that. Anyway, but I can't remember what it's called, but it's a great little book. And William, I'm sorry we didn't get to debate. It sounds like a fun one, but yeah, this is the problem also with not being able to travel and do this in person. We would take it to a coffee shop or a bar, and we get to do that. But I will take you up on that sometime. I promise, my friend.